Great. Good afternoon and welcome to the first seminar in the 2017 summer series of the Digital Classicist London. This week we're extremely pleased to welcome Sarah Middle from the Open University, who's going to talk to us about linked data and ancient world research, studying past projects from user perspective.
Thank you. I'm Sarah. I'm a PhD student at the Open University, and I'm going to be talking about my work in studying linked data projects relating to the ancient world by linking the data about those projects. So I'm going to start off with a bit of background about my research and about linked data a bit more generally, before going on to talk about my process in linking the data about AHRC-funded projects. I'm going to go into some of the work I've done with Sparkle queries and producing visualizations, including trying out various tools for producing those visualizations. There are several projects, linked data projects from the areas of classics and archaeology that I'm going to go into in a bit more detail from a user perspective before applying those findings to the usability of my own data. I'll finish off with some of my initial findings before talking about how I intend to take the work forward in future. You'll notice on the bottom left-hand corner of each of the slides, there is a URL there, and that links to a publicly viewable Google Doc that has all of the links to all my sources in it. So rather than noting down every single link that I've got, you just need that one and they'll all be there. Okay, so I first became interested in the ideas behind linked data in about 2007, although I didn't know what linked data was then. I was studying my master's in archaeology and looking at items relating to personal adornment that were found at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia in Sparta. While I was doing this research, I was really interested in seeing what similar finds were from other excavations in a similar sort of area throughout the Greek world, and comparing them with the site to try and kind of establish patterns of communication and contact between these different places. That necessitated a lot of looking through excavation reports because much of this data was not yet online. And the whole way through I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if there was this resource where I could type in, say, fibula and put in things like material, time period, geographical area, and it would return to me results from all over the world, from lots of different museums and collections. So that resource doesn't exist yet, but if it did exist, then linked data would probably be a good way of going about it. So linked data is a way of connecting up different items from different digital collections based on features that they have in common by describing them and their relationships with each other in a way that can be understood by a computer. The example that I've got on the screen here is based on the idea of Pelagios, which is the project I'm going to be talking about a bit later on. All of these items here are objects held in different digital collections that have all been described using linked data, and they all have some connection to Sparta. Now, because they've all been described in this way, it's then possible to create an interface whereby Sparta on a map can link out to all these different objects held in their different digital collections. Now, this clearly has huge potential for humanities research in terms of making searches more efficient, making data more discoverable, and in being able to determine relationships between objects that might not have been possible otherwise. However, it doesn't seem to have been used as much in humanities as it perhaps might have been. And so what I'm going to do in my PhD is to explore why this might be the case, what the potential benefits of the linked data approach could be to a humanities project with specific reference to topics related to the ancient world, and how it might be better integrated with existing research methodologies. To do this, I'm going to be looking at past projects, both those that have used linked data sort of successfully or unsuccessfully, and projects that have used a different approach to structuring their data, but which might have benefited from a linked data approach. Now, because it's quite easy to find evidence of projects that have done something, but not so easy to find evidence of projects that haven't done something, I thought it would be good to, initially at least, restrict this to a population, so one sort of large data set from which to select my sample projects. So the data set I'm using is from the Gateway to Research. This is a publicly available service from Research Councils UK that provides the data about all the projects that they've funded since 2006. And that includes over 5,000 projects that have been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the AHRC. Now there is a search facility on this interface, you can see from the screenshot there is a search bar. But it's not possible to do more complex queries, in particular if your queries relate to different sort of sections of the data. So if you're interested in things like subject keywords and outputs from a project, you can't really search both of those together. It tends to be much more geared up towards administrative reporting rather than looking at project content. Another way of accessing the data is through the API, and you can extract the data in JSON format, JavaScript object notation. Within the context of the Gateway to Research, this JSON data takes this sort of hierarchical tree structure. So you've got, say, a project object, which is your overarching object, and that contains a title, an abstract, and an output. And then these objects may or may not then contain other objects underneath it. So it just builds up this structure, and that's sort of a sample. This is good in that it gives you some indication as a sort of human reader about how these fields relate to each other and where they're contained within the structure. But it's not very good at displaying complex relationships. For example, where a field might relate to different places in the hierarchy. And it also doesn't tell the computer what the relationships between these fields actually are. It knows that there is a thing called project, and that contains a thing called title, but it doesn't know the thing called title is a title. So for those reasons, and also to give me some practical experience in converting a dataset to linked data, I decided that I would convert this dataset to linked data. I started off by creating a network diagram. So this is just a small section of the all the fields available within the data that described what these fields actually are and their relationships to each other. Once I'd done that, I then applied established ontologies, so controlled vocabularies that are an established standard way of referring to these terms and relationships. And you can see here that now the project has a title, which is title A. So it's telling the computer that this piece of data here is a title. Now, to convert this to linked data takes the format of triples, which are expressed in what's called the Resource Description Framework, or RDF. And the triple consists of 3 pieces of data, which is a subject, which is, for example, the project, the predicate, which is the relationship between the 2 pieces of data, so that has title, and then the object, which is the piece of data that connects to the subject, so that would be title A. So you can see from this network diagram that it's basically just made up of these different triples, these different sort of small sections of data that come together to create these relationships. So I made a Python script that iterated through all of the AHRC projects and converted the data to a series of triples. So this is basically what it looks like with all the triples listed, except in the actual data set, there are about 700,000 of these triples for all of the projects. That data is now published under an open government license on the data.open repository, so that can be accessed from the URL there, but it's also linked from the Google Doc as well. Now that that's linked from the Open University's data repository, you can actually query it using their Sparkle endpoint. And that's what that looks like. So there's a box there to put in your Sparkle query, and then that's what your results look like, or you can choose to download the results to the CSV. So that's great if you know Sparkle or if you have the time or the patience to learn Sparkle. But one of the ways that I would like to enhance this data further is to be able to create an accessible interface so anyone can explore it. Another thing that I wanted to do in terms of querying the data was to look at different tools for visualizing it. Now, there are lots of these tools about, and there's a huge body of literature on it. But if you're interested in looking at this further, I'd suggest the surveys by Dadsey and Patriga and Dadsey and Rowe, who go through kind of lots of these tools sort of in more detail, in quite sort of understandable language. The main problem that I've found with several of these tools, I've given a couple of examples there, is that the usability has often been overestimated by the developers. There have been quite a few where the tool's been described as being suitable for a layperson to use, but even though I already have some experience of using linked data and I'm quite familiar with the sorts of structures, there were some that I just found myself completely unable to use. And I think there is a real opportunity for researchers and developers to work together to be able to create these tools for their mutual benefit, because then if the tool's more widely used, it's more likely to continue to be maintained. And various other issues include that some of these tools only work with specific data sets. In particular, a lot of them are set up to only work with DBpedia, which is the data version of Wikipedia. Some of them, the demo doesn't quite work as expected. installations complex, and some of them are no longer available, no longer seem to be available. So generally, it wasn't particularly promising looking at these various tools, but there were a couple that I found a bit more interesting that I'm going to have a look at now. First one of these is LOD Live. So this is the tool for exploring data sets. And you can see here that I've got the data.open data set there, and you can expand it out to all the different nodes held up in the different kind of sub-data sets within it. And you can see sort of the classes, so the different types of fields that are held up in the data set, and the different relationships between them. This is quite a nice intuitive interface. It's quite simple. There are various different ways of sort of configuring the layout and how it looks, and kind of moving around the different nodes so that you can get the view that you're interested in. My only criticism would be that it does use up a lot of browser processing power, so it's kind of fallen over most of the times when I've used it. But I do think it's quite impressive when it works. The tool I actually ended up using for my visualizations is Gephi. Now, Gephi is not specifically a linked data tool. It's actually more of a generic graph visualization tool for sort of network diagrams in particular. But it does have a semantic web import plugin, and that allows you to put a SPARQL query, so using the linked data query language, directly into this visualization software to construct a visualization. And that's one of the examples that I'm going to be showing you in a few slides' time. So to go into the sorts of queries that I did on the data, I first wanted to get more of a general overview of the sort of picture across the humanities. And one of the sort of easiest ways of doing that was to search for projects that have a research database and model output. Now, when a researcher who's worked on a project submits data to the Gateway to Research about the project they've been working on, there are various different categories of data. Outputs is one of the sections, so anything that's come out of a project, like sort of publications, software, artworks, talks, for example. And one of these categories is research database and models. So this is quite an easy thing to search on. Found that 7% of projects from across the AHRC data have produced some kind of database and research database and model, which is still relatively low. And you can see it has increased, the numbers are quite small on there, but the bottom of the graph there, you've got the beginning of 2006, and it has increased quite a bit up to about 2008, and then it sort of plateaued a bit almost, and it's gone up and down. So that shows that perhaps there's not so much of an increase, there's sort of initial interest, and then it's not really caught on as much as perhaps would have been anticipated. There's also a bit of a decline towards the end of the graph, but I think that's probably more to do with the fact that some of these projects haven't finished yet, or they've only recently finished, and the full kind of output data hasn't actually been input yet into the Gateway to Research. I also wanted to look at classics and archaeology projects because I'm specifically interested in the ancient world. And this was done by looking at the controlled vocabulary of subject keywords that you can apply to projects within the Gateway to Research. So these are all the keywords that I could find that relate to classics or archaeology. So I did a keyword search with those, and it came up with about 8% of projects that contain these keywords. I then put the two together to look at what proportion of classics and archaeology projects have a research database and model output. And this is actually really encouraging because it's 17%, so about twice as much as you would expect, sort of proportionally from the amount of classics and archaeology projects as a whole. I suspect this is possibly because archaeology does have quite a tradition of producing digital data, so that's probably added to the figures quite a bit. I then want to look at projects that had some involvement with linked data. Now, this isn't quite so easy as the other searches because there isn't a way of sort of officially designating in some kind of controlled vocabulary to the Gateway to Research that your project has involved linked data specifically. So I did a sort of keyword phrase search in the project title, the project abstract, output title, and output description, because I thought that would catch anywhere where linked data would be mentioned. And that came up with 24 projects, which is just under 0.5% of all of the AHRC-funded projects. So it's still a really tiny proportion. You can see from the graph that it has increased. From about 2012, there's a huge spike there, going into having 11 concurrent projects in 2014. But then that's tailed off, which might be for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. There might be more data to come in about these later projects. So potentially there might be an increase there, although it might just be that linked data was particularly hot topic in 2014. If you're interested in exploring this data, I have produced a timeline using visualization software called ViewShare on the link there, where you can actually look at the data about these projects within data.open. So that provides a little bit of a way into the data rather than actually having to do the Sparkle query. Another thing that I was interested in looking at was the social networks behind the projects. So this diagram here, this was produced using Gephi, which I was talking about earlier on, and it links the projects based on people and institutions that they have in common. Now from this you can see that half of the projects are on the top left, and they all seem to be linked together in this network, which indicates that there's quite a bit of knowledge sharing going on between these different people and institutions. So potentially that could mean that these projects could be more successful because there's more of an infrastructure around them. However, I should point out that the smaller networks and sort of lone projects as well, it doesn't mean that they're not talking to each other. These are just sort of formalized official relationships that can be derived from the AHRC project data. Another thing I wanted to look at was what the relationship to linked data actually was within these projects. So what role does linked data play within the project? The fact that they've just mentioned the keywords doesn't really tell you very much. So what I did was to classify each of the projects into one of these categories. There is one project that I was completely uncertain about what relationship linked data actually has. There was a small mention of the semantic web somewhere, but I think I wasn't sure how much it actually had a relationship to the project. So that's 23 of the projects that are shown on the diagram. But the vast majority of those involve production of new data. And that encompasses both data that was completely new, as well as data that didn't previously exist in linked data form, but was converted as part of the project. Some of those projects did also then work to enhance the data and to answer research questions through consuming that data. But there's only one project that solely consumed existing data, and two that enhanced existing linked data, and which I thought was interesting in that it might indicate that there is either a real or perceived bias from the funder in terms of funding projects that seem to be doing something new and innovative, as opposed to projects that are really working on improving something that already exists. So whether that is actually a bias from the funder, or whether it's a perceived need from grant applicants that they need to be seen as doing something innovative when they're applying for grants for new projects. But I would argue that the projects that enhance or consume data are as important, if not more important, than the projects that produce new data, because they then allow that data to be used by different audiences. I also should point out there are two projects on there that didn't involve linked data at all, and that was quite interesting in itself. One of them used words around linking data, but then referred to a relational database to link that data, and another one compared this project with another semantic web project. So it's not a great indicator really of how many of these projects did actually use linked data, but there were 21 of the projects where I'm very confident that linked data was actually involved. I then wanted to look at how much of these projects were from classics or archaeology, and this is a quarter this time. So again, the percentage is going up, so it shows that classics and archaeology as disciplines are pretty engaged with the topic of linked data. I'm now going to go into some of these classics and archaeology projects in more detail. So the first one is Pelagios. Now Pelagios is led by the Open University, and it started life in 2011 as a project where classical texts were annotated and linked to their relevant uniform resource identifiers for locations mentioned within them, which are held in the Pelagios gazetteer. So basically, you look through the text, you find a place, and you can annotate it using this identifier that will then be able to link it to the gazetteer. What this means is that you can link from the document to the place, but you can also link from the place back to the document. Now, Pelagios has grown since then. The AHRC-funded component of the project occurred in 2014, when it's already been going for about 3 years. And it now encompasses a much wider geographical and temporal scope. It's also got a very lively community that surrounds it, and that's really key to its development. It's very user-focused in its development, and it's produced a tool called Recogito, which allows users to annotate texts and link them to these uniform resource identifiers without having any previous knowledge of linked data, which is really helpful, and it opens up these resources to a much wider user community. But looking at Pelagios from a user perspective, I wanted to search Pelagios to look for finds at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, which is what I was studying for my master's. So it's quite nice and simple, very minimalist to start off with. You have a very basic search bar, you start typing in your query, and then it auto-suggests some options, which is great, so it shows me immediately that Artemis Orthia is in fact something on which Pelagios has some information. When I click on the Artemis Orthia option, it then zooms into the correct part of the map, and it gives me some other options about how I might want to refine my search. So I can choose to use the sliders to focus on a specific date range. So that's any date this is attached to, any of the items found at that site is included within that range shown on the top filter. You can also filter objects by type, but the only types I could find were item or location. So I thought that might be a bit more interesting to divide those items up into objects and texts. So you're looking at it from sort of an archaeological or a literary point of view. And you can also select a data source, although for these objects, they were all from the same data source, which was Arachne. The actual objects are linked towards the bottom, so those are the actual results, and each of those links out to the relevant record in the Arachne database. So what Pelagios does is it doesn't actually host this data itself, it links out to the relevant records in digital collections where these objects can be found. So all it's maintaining is this kind of central backbone of data that does the linking rather than the data itself. Generally, I find Pelagios interface to be very intuitive to use, particularly sort of the starting off basic and then being able to sort of drill down a bit further. Although I did find the minimalist nature to it a little bit confusing on occasion, I did do a bit of button pressing for the various icons to work out what each of them did, because sometimes it wasn't completely explained. But really, I didn't have too many problems with it. I think it's a really great resource, and it provides quite a low barrier to entry for people who might not know what linked data is, but might be interested in exploring this sort of resource. I then went on to look at Snapdragon. So this is a project from King's College London, which also took place in 2014. And this is a similar idea to Pelagios, but it's the idea is to link people rather than places. So to bring together various different data sets referring to people, for example, the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names and the British Museum's people database, to link these together to be able to kind of have these uniform resource identifiers for people, like Pelagios has been linking to in the Pleiades Gazetteer for place. Now, that's an important difference because Pelagios did already have this gazetteer to link to, but Snapdragon had to create these authority records itself. The other difference is that Snapdragon unfortunately ran out of funding before being able to create a user-friendly interface in order to be able to explore the data. And that, I think, is quite a good illustration of the importance of these projects of enhancing and consuming the data, rather than just focusing on production of data, or perhaps even to offer follow-on funding to these projects that have produced data in order to actually make it a usable resource and make it accessible to a wider audience. So at the moment, the searching the Snapdragon is done by the Sparkle endpoint. So you need to know how to do Sparkle queries. But there is quite a clear and helpful tutorial on the website that guides you through creating a basic Sparkle query, although it does also require getting the uniform resource identifier for a person from another database and inputting it into the query, which I found a bit difficult because some of these other databases are not particularly easy to use. And that really highlighted to me the importance of having Snapdragon as a resource to be able to access this data about people. So this is the Sparkle endpoint. So this is essentially the search interface for Snapdragon. That's the example query that I've got on the left. And on the right is the output from that query. So when you press the execute button for the query, it automatically downloads an XML file to your browser, which you can then open up in the text editor. Now, this is fine for me because I've got a nice text editor that does syntax highlighting, so I can see immediately that there's this black text there that's the URL, and that's what I'm interested in to copy and paste into my browser. But I think if I was less familiar with XML, or if I was just using Notepad, for example, that might be a little bit confusing. And once I've pasted the URL of the result into the browser, this is what it looks like. So you can see there's a huge amount of information that's available within this resource. So it links out to other data sets in a similar way to Pelagios. You've got associated places and dates and mentions of this person's name in historical text. So a lot of this data is there already. It's just actually being able to discover it that is potentially the issue here. And there is a great argument for why projects should be looking at enhancing and consuming data rather than simply producing it. The next projects I'm going to look at all together because they followed on from each other. And these are Scarcella and SENESCHAL, which are 3 projects that were led by the University of Glamorgan, which is now the University of South Wales, who worked with the Archaeology Data Service and English Heritage. And the idea behind these projects was to enhance the discoverability of archaeological data and grey literature. And they did this by producing linked data from existing data and by enhancing existing thesauri by converting them to linked data and aligning different terms in thesauri. So where multiple thesauri have one term that means the same sort of thing, to actually map those terms together so that the data that uses either of them can be linked to each other. This data, well, some of this data can be searched via Barque Search, which is from the Archaeology Data Service, although I do have to say this is not the only mechanism for searching data that has been produced by these 3 projects, because it is used by, say, English Heritage, by the Royal Commission of Ancient and Historical Monuments, both Scotland and Wales, and by Historic England as well. So this is just merely one mechanism by which to access some of the data that was involved in this project. So again, like Pelagios, it's a fairly basic search page to start off with, so just a keyword search. There is also a word cloud underneath it, which I think is supposed to link to all the different records that have these particular terms annotated on them, but I don't think it works at the moment because it just directs me back to the search page each time I tried. And when I typed in my search, which is brooch, I'm looking for a Roman brooch. This is the interface that I'm presented with. So you're able to refine your search by the categories of what, when, and where. So what, you can look through all the different types of objects or monuments and really drill down through this hierarchy to quite a detailed level to be able to find exactly what you're looking for. You can also do a similar thing for time periods. So you can't see from the actual hierarchy because it's too far down the screenshot, but on the top you can see my query, and I've chosen Roman for the when part of my query. I could also additionally choose to refine the search further by using geographical area as well. Now, I find this was a really interesting and intuitive way of exploring the data in detail, but giving quite an easy way into the data in the first place for just doing a general search. So it's sort of the best of both worlds. But I did also find that perhaps could have been a bit more detailed, particularly on the time periods, because Roman is quite a long time period. It'd be quite nice to actually be able to sort of pick out specific date ranges within that, because it doesn't go into any more detail further from that. And this is an example record of from Barque Search. So this is what a record looks like. I just wanted to mention here about the keywords. So I was talking earlier about how it was really great that you have this hierarchy of keywords, and they all have these controlled terms associated with them. On the period and subject section, which is just underneath the geographical section, you can see that the keywords are mentioned there. And what I would have really liked would have been to click on one of those and see every single item that had this keyword associated with it. However, unfortunately, they're just in there as plain text. So I feel that there could have been a better way of actually linking these records together and actually having a more smoother exploration interface, as well as simply finding an individual record. The other thing that Scarcella and SENESCHAL did was to produce linked data, and this is the Archaeology Data Services Linked Open Data website, which contains linked data produced as part of the Stella project. Now, this can only be queried via the Sparkle endpoint, but the data is also contained within AHRC-Search as well. So this is just an alternative means by which to search the data. Say if you're a developer or you have very, very specific needs to do a complex query, it just gives you an alternative way into this subset of data, which I think is quite an interesting feature and is quite helpful to different groups of people who want to use the data, although this isn't the data as a whole. So after looking through these projects, I wanted to look at how I could apply my findings to my own data and to make that more useful. Because as I mentioned earlier, my data is just sitting behind the Sparkle endpoint. So you need to know Sparkle in order to be able to query it. The first thing that I thought of doing was to take the example of Snapdragon and actually create some clear documentation about how the data can be explored, and just provide some simple Sparkle queries that people are able to copy and paste and then just change keywords in them. That doesn't require a huge amount of effort and doesn't require any coding at all. So that's something that I could quite easily do more immediately. But also I want to expand access to the data a bit further, and to do that I do need to create a search interface. So like Pelagios and the Scarcella and SENESCHAL projects, I would want to start that off with a very basic keyword search to allow quite a low point of entry in, so anyone can access it just to do a very basic query, put some keywords in. If they found anywhere in a project, then that project will come up. But I also would want people to be able to refine that further, and I like that faceted browsing idea from AHRC-Search, where you can really drill down into that hierarchy, but also the filtering aspect of Pelagios, where you had the date sliders, where you were able to choose quite exact date range for objects that you're interested in. I would like to provide an option to search all of the nodes and fields, but I'm conscious of the fact that having lots of information and lots of options in one interface can be quite overwhelming to the user. So that's something that I would need to think quite carefully about doing, while still providing that flexibility but maintaining the usability of it. I would be keen to have clear linking between the different entities. So for example, if I had a project shown on a web page, to have the subject keywords that are associated with that project as links that would then link to other projects that have that keyword attached to it. I think that would be a much more intuitive way of exploring the data and to be able to find connections between projects that you wouldn't necessarily in a list of results. Similarly, like Pelagios with its map interface, I would like to visualize the data in some way. Potentially that might be to do with the social networks that I was looking at earlier on, or I might want to make a map of these projects because they do all have their geographical region attached to them. That would be something that I could do quite readily. So different ways of accessing the data that aren't just by a list of results, something that actually shows things like relationships so that people can look at connections, because that's what linked data is all about. The other thing that I would want to do is to make sure that technical users who actually want to produce more sort of complex queries and to have more flexible access to the data should be directed to data.open website to be able to have access to the Sparkle endpoints, and then vice versa to be able to link people between the two. So in terms of my initial findings, I found that converting the AHRC project data to linked data has facilitated much more detailed queries than would have been possible just simply from using the gateway to research. And in querying the data, I found there has been an increase in humanities projects that have produced digital data, but it's still relatively low in percentage. So that was the 7% that we saw earlier on. Linked data projects are even more rare than that. So that's 0.5% of the projects had some involvement with linked data. But the examples that I've shown have hopefully demonstrated how linked data has been used to enhance discovery in classics and archaeology. The other thing that I found with the AHRC projects is that there seems to be this focus on data production rather than data consumption or data enhancement. And that's something that I'm quite keen to explore, as I think that could be quite a considerable barrier to uptake of these resources, but also to their sustainability in the long term. I've also identified various features to improve usability, and the particular ones that I want to highlight here are clear documentation, basic to advanced search options, so starting with basic and going more advanced, and then providing a visual overview of the data rather than a simple results page. In future, I intend to enhance the data about AHRC projects further by using external links to link the data out to people, publications, institutions, so that it's truly linked. It's not just linked to itself, it's actually linked out to the wider web. I would also like to describe the project using terms from the existing vocabulary that describes their research methods. So there are various ontologies that exist for describing research methods. In particular, one's recently been developed by the Network of Digital Methods in the Arts and Humanities, NEDIMA, which is called NEMA. So that's the NEMO, which is the NEDIMA Methods ontology. And that's one that I'm particularly interested in looking at describing my data with. So that will make it then, and the search options really, for people to be able to search by research methods rather than research outputs or any of the sort of criteria that have been imposed by the Gateway to Research. I want to develop a user-friendly query interface, as I mentioned before, so that I can widen access to my data. I also would like to do a full evaluation of the Classics and Archaeology linked data project. So I've given a bit of a taster of the sort of usability of these projects earlier on, but I would like to analyse them in a bit more detail, also looking at their, their sustainability and the encoding standards that they've used. And parallel to that, I want to look at identifying non-linked data projects, so projects that have used a different form of structuring data, but that might have benefited from a linked data approach. So I mentioned earlier on there was a project that represented social networks through using a relational, through using a relational database. I've also found a project that uses TEI to link between different texts in the digitised archive. I would like to interview people involved with projects, so both the linked data projects and the non-linked data projects, in order to ascertain why particular decisions were made in terms of structuring data and the advantages and disadvantages that these approaches brought, because then that will help me to think about whether or not linked data actually has helped these projects or would have helped the projects in the cases where linked data wasn't used. I'm also very conscious that my data might be subject to the bias of being restricted to the AHRC dataset. This might well not be the same picture as data from other funders. So I do want to look at people who have funded other projects to see how my data compares with projects that have been funded by other people, and to see if the same conclusions can be drawn from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll take the first couple of questions with the live stream still on, and then we'll turn that off for people to ask unrestrainedly. So, since one of my projects was one going to analyse dinner, I probably should have asked the first question on this occasion.
Sarah, thank you very much for a great talk. I'm going to ask you other questions later. The question now from this is, how far down the road have you gone? How much longer have you got on this project? Because that will inform my question later.
Okay, well, I'm in my first year at the moment.
Your first year.
So yeah, another couple of years.
Another couple of years.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll come back to you later.
Well, it strikes me that there's an interesting historical, I mean, 20 years ago, nobody was using linked data because there was nothing to link to. And so one of the interesting things to look at would be what the stimuli are that are gradually making it clear to people what the benefits of linked data are, and whether this is characteristic of particular areas of study where it's easy to do, and other areas of study where it still would be wonderful, but you can't yet.
Yes, or it might not be desirable to do so.
Yeah. I think that would be a very interesting part of your analysis.
Yes, definitely, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting talk. I mean, I think it's important that there's more analysis of the way that digital technology is used in humanities in general, and there's a bit of a feedback loop there, so that's great. I was wondering about what you thought the purpose of, first of all, the intention of producing linked data is for these different projects, and how you might go about, first of all, examining that intention, and second, measuring whether that is being fulfilled. But do you think that these, in producing linked data, they're trying to generate citations for their projects? Are they aiming at their data at humanities, traditional humanities scholars reviews, or are they looking at digital humanities scholars to use?
I think several of the projects have actually kind of explicitly said that they're interested in both sorts of researchers. So kind of from the general public right through to academic researchers, and from digital right through to analog researchers. Sorry. Oh, sorry, what was the rest of your question?
No, it was quite no, I was just, firstly, what the purpose of the linked data was, what their intention for it, and how we might measure whether those intentions have been, or objectives have been met.
Yeah, I think in some projects, the aim has really been about increasing discoverability. So about bringing to light data that's been kind of sitting around in various different silos on the web to try and make that a bit more visible. And also to kind of generally increase access to it. There's been a bit more of a sort of collaborative atmosphere in the humanities, particularly recently, I think, and that's kind of helping to bring together these different data sets from different places. So the collaboration aspect, I think, also has a part to play. I think it does help in increasing citations. I mean, data discoverability in particular helps data to be seen and to make it easier to cite that data as an actual resource, like you would with a piece of literature. But I don't know if that's necessarily the aim, but I think it's definitely an outcome.
Okay, I'll turn off the broadcast before we carry on. And Ross, feel free to ask another question. I'm doing so.
We can open the window now, so